And without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. But before I deliver my opening remarks, I wanted to note the circumstances under which we're meeting today. Pursuant to House Resolution 8, the subcommittee is meeting virtually. I have a couple of reminders for members about the conduct of this remote hearing. First, members should keep their video feed on as long as they are present at the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones. And please also keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking. And finally, if members have documents that they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email addresses was circulated prior to the hearing. Well, good afternoon and welcome to our members and panelists. Thank you for joining us for this important hearing on supply chain cybersecurity. We're focusing on the software supply chain today, and cybersecurity attacks throughout the software supply chain are especially insidious. A company can deploy a digitally signed software update from a trusted partner, but unless they are willing to do a complete cybersecurity analysis of that update, they are wide open to any significant breach of cyber hygiene in their trusted provider. So supply chain attacks are harder to detect, to prevent, and to remediate than traditional malware. And once an adversary is in the system, they can deploy multiple types of attacks to maintain access and steal data. They might run amok on your system for a long time once they're in because the access came through a trusted partner and can be reinstalled. In the case of SolarWinds, the Russian intelligence service embedded a backdoor in the company's Orion software in the fall of 2019, and customers were downloading that infected software by the spring. 18,000 organizations did this over the course of 2020, and not one of them realized that they had a company on their networks until FireEye detected the breach of their own systems and sounded the alarm in December. I want to thank FireEye for moving quickly to alert public officials to what it had discovered. This is a well-regarded cybersecurity company that was itself breached by a malicious actor. They might have worried about how news of the hack could affect the company's reputation, but they did the right thing anyway. And we are all aware of the fact that FireEye could have just as easily kept quiet to protect their reputation, because there is no requirement for private companies to disclose a cybersecurity breach to the federal government. If a reputable cybersecurity company like FireEye can be breached by an attack like this, any organization can. As we will hear from our Atlantic Council witness, Dr. Herr, the supply chain cyber attacks are ticking up. In fact, we've seen several alarming incidents reported even since the SolarWinds breach was disclosed in December. As a semi-separate item, I have concerns about whether the federal agencies are doing enough to enforce best practices to reduce their exposure to cyber risks, and whether they have systems in place to respond quickly enough to a significant breach. Last summer, Microsoft discovered a serious vulnerability called Zero Logon that made it possible for the hackers to impersonate any computer on the network, including the system designed to identify and authenticated trusted people on the network. And I have to say that when I read the technical description of that flaw, I found that its existence in such a crucial piece of software and the simplicity of the attack sort of breathtaking. This was very different than, say, the technical details of the Meltdown Inspector flaws of a couple of years back, when I was frankly blown away by their sophistication and complexity. It's clear to me that we need some mechanism to put more eyes on such commonly used and critical software. But the federal issue here is that Microsoft issued the first of two patches on August 11th of last year, and by late September, some federal agencies still had failed to update their systems. The DHS Cybersecurity Office had to issue an emergency order to force agencies to patch or disable affected Windows servers. Meanwhile, it was discovered that the breach was already being exploited in the wild by at least Iranian and Russian hackers. Malicious actors with a creative flair for exploiting technology are working every day to put Americans at risk, but engineers at NIST and other federal agencies are innovating too. President Biden has recently released an executive order on improving federal cybersecurity that calls on agencies to take bold actions to address the challenge of software supply chain security and other items. I look forward to hearing today about the likely effectiveness of this executive order and how the federal science apparatus can do more to help understand the threat and help private and public sectors mitigate that risk. And finally, As the only PhD physicist, though not the only PhD scientist on this committee and in Congress, and also an integrated circuit designer, I have to say how glad I am to be able to partner with Ranking Member Obernolte on this important matter. I believe he's the first and only member of Congress with an advanced degree in artificial intelligence, and I'll ask him to put his Caltech electrical engineering and information technology executive hats back on today to help us get nearer the heart of this matter. I thank him and his staff for their partnership, and I yield to him for an opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Foster, and thank you for holding this hearing on an extremely important topic. I found the GAO report on supply chain risk management from December to be truly alarming. And the thing that stood out to me about that report was the finding that of the organizations the GAO looked at, they identified core supply chain risk management best practices, and then went through 23 different agencies looking at how many of those best practices were being implemented. And this is what stood out to me. For over half of the organizations, none of the best practices were being implemented. So to me, that points to a failure of governance. And I think that we are at an important position here to build on the executive order and to call attention to this problem. And this hearing is a critical part of doing that. So for myself, what I'm hoping to get out of this hearing is the answer to three different questions, one of which is why isn't the guidance being followed? The second of which is how can the guidance be easier to implement? And the third of which is how does the guidance need to change to meet these emerging threats? And I think recent events have shown just how vulnerable our supply chain can be. I think as we conduct this hearing, we're going to find that our organizations fall into three different categories. We have organizations that are federal agencies, we have organizations that federal agencies contract with, and then we have organizations that are private industry organizations, but still have a significant impact on our supply chain. And I think that those organizations also need to be included in this discussion. The Colonial Pipeline incident of the last couple of weeks, I think, really graphically illustrates just how big those risks are. And in closing, I want to point out that if the outcome of this whole process is just another PDF or another spreadsheet, I think we will have failed, because that's not going to make the change that we need to make. I really think we're going to have to take a more proactive approach at highlighting what the vulnerabilities are and at helping organizations evaluate for themselves which of those best practices and guidance are being followed and which are not. And I'm hopeful that we can do that in a way that really doesn't resemble overregulation, but is really government being helpful. So again, thank you very much, Chairman Foster, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses. I yield back.
Thank you. And the chair will now recognize Ms. Stevens for an opening statement.
Yeah, thank you so much, Congressman and Dr. Foster. Thank you to you and Congressman Obernolte for holding today's hearing, and I'm pleased to give opening remarks on behalf of the Research and Technology Subcommittee that has direct oversight of the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, which we're certainly going to be talking about today as it relates to our supply chain vulnerability, something that we know very well here in Michigan. It's very real. Right across from me is a poster from the Michigan Manufacturing Technology Center, our NIST MEP Center, located just a few short miles from where I sit right now on our cybersecurity and Industry 4.0 imperative. So it's clear that this hearing is coming at a critical and an auspicious time. President Biden's recent executive order improving the nation's cybersecurity represents what I hope to be a sea change in how the federal government approaches cybersecurity, from modernizing federal IT systems to strengthening how the government responds to cyber threats from our adversaries. The executive order also focuses heavily on software supply chain issues, which is the topic of this hearing. The executive order seeks to help software developers identify vulnerabilities before they release their software, and helps consumers better understand the security and certainly the best practices that are going to be a huge part of setting the standards and level setting industries of scale here. It should not be a surprise that we're ready to lean in on the NIST component and have NIST represented here on this panel to talk about their leadership in cybersecurity. I was bragging about NIST cybersecurity initiatives earlier today. NIST has played a huge role in the implementation of the executive order I just referenced. The agency is going to develop a broad set of standards for the security of the supply chain within 90 days. Within 60 days, the agency is also going to identify and define what constitutes as critical software and create special standards to protect it. Also, within 60 days, NIST will develop standards so that software developers can test their source code. This is something Dr. Baird and I explored and sat down together on in a meeting. It wasn't a hearing; it was a meeting last legislative session of Congress. These are certainly aggressive timelines. And I only mentioned some of the things that NIST is going to be doing, but it's, again, just a reminder of the important and critical role they play that is highly respected in incorporating input from private and public sector partners to develop effective cybersecurity standards. This work is certainly going to take time and resources, no doubt about that. NIST's entire cybersecurity and privacy portfolio was funded at only $78 million in the last year's budget. And, we think about the economic ramifications of cybersecurity attacks. Those tally up to that number, within seconds, should there be a cybersecurity attack. So I do worry that we are increasingly asking NIST experts to do exponentially more work more quickly without necessarily the adequate resources. We've referenced and talked about the GAO. They have found that federal agencies are not adopting the guidelines already on the books to deal with software supply chain threats. We're certainly seeing this across industries. I've had these conversations here in Michigan, particularly in our manufacturing sectors, automotive, defense, aerospace. Additional guidance is maybe going to be necessary, but we also must ensure agencies prioritize the implementation of the guidance that already exists and provides adequate resources for them to do so. Congress and the Biden administration must and will think creatively about modernizing the federal government's approach to cybersecurity. I welcome the recommendations of this expert panel on how we can ensure that cybersecurity guidance is developed as part of the executive order that is operational, effective, and relatively easy to adopt. I want to thank our witnesses again, as well as our other subcommittee chairs, for helping us tackle these issues. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. And the chair will now recognize Mr. Waltz for an opening statement.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Foster and Chairwoman Stevens for holding this joint hearing. I also want to thank our panel of witnesses for their participation, and I am looking forward to hearing their testimony today. And I hope we will all be able to use this opportunity to learn more about software supply chain attacks or impacts on federal agencies. And I share everyone's sentiments on how to improve our nation's software supply chain security. So the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology has held several hearings over the years. Some of them have been mentioned on bolstering the federal government's cybersecurity posture. I'm pleased to see that this committee is playing such an active role in that posture. Obviously, the recent SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange, Colonial Pipeline incidents make it clear that the United States is being continuously targeted with malicious cyber attacks. When I was in business, there was the saying, those that have been attacked and those that don't know they've been attacked by various criminal actors and nation states. So unfortunately, these attacks are not the first. They won't be the last. I share the chairwoman's focus on NIST as the primary federal agency responsible for setting standards and guidelines for federal agencies and providing voluntary best practices for private industry. It's worth noting that in 2014, NIST published a voluntary risk-based cybersecurity framework with a set of industry standards and best practices to help organizations manage these risks. NIST also established guidance specifically related to supply chain security, including the cyber supply chain risk management, the SCRM framework, and the secure software development framework to help identify, assess, and mitigate these risks. On May of this year, as Chairwoman Stephen mentioned, the President issued his EO on improving the nation's cybersecurity and trust multiple federal agencies, including NIST, with strengthening the security of software supply chain. I think it's worth noting Section 4 of the EO directs the Secretary of Commerce through NIST to consult with federal agencies, private sector, academia, all of the stakeholders to identify or develop standards, tools, best practices, and other guidelines to enhance our supply chain security. And based on my experience, 25 years now in the National Guard, I would encourage NIST and would love to see them consult with the cyber talent within the Guard and the Reserve in executing Section 4 of the EO. The Guard and the Reserve really does retain elite cyber talent from Silicon Valley, the private sector, as well as the Pentagon, and truly can serve as a bridge between the private sector and federal government with their various authorities. I think the EO is a good starting point for addressing these vulnerabilities in our nation's software supply chain, but obviously we have a long way to go, a lot more work to do. As been mentioned, the recent GAO report it really is alarming in assessing that federal information and communications supply chain risk management practices, and the findings that none of the federal agencies reviewed had implemented the recommended practices. 60% of these agencies had not implemented any of the practices. None had fully implemented those practices. And as a result, GAO identifies the 145 recommendations for agencies to fully implement foundational practices in their approach to ICT SCRM. Moving forward, I do think we need to provide agencies with the resources and push them, frankly, to move more quickly to close the gap between these recommendations and implementations of foundational practices. Cyber frameworks are otherwise useless, frankly, unless proper funding and support are available to fully implement them. Additionally, the National Science Foundation's Cyber Corps Scholarship for Service program should receive consideration by the committee for enhancing the federal government's cybersecurity workforce. Time truly is of the essence here. It's imperative that we modernize these defenses and get ahead of our adversaries. We cannot afford to continue to allow foreign adversaries and criminals, often working together, witting and unwitting, to take advantages of our weaknesses in software supply chains. I think we've seen in recent days that the consequences truly can be catastrophic and detrimental to the economic and national security of the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And if there are any other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Matthew Scholl. Mr. Scholl is the chief of the Computer Security Division of the Information Technology Laboratory at NIST. His research program cultivates trust in information technology through standards and measurements, and by testing the interoperability, security, and reliability of cybersecurity systems. The guidance produced by his program is widely used by federal agencies and U.S. industry. He also co-leads NIST's participation with cybersecurity national and international standards development organizations. After Mr. Scholl is Dr. Trey Herr. Dr. Herr is the director of the Cyber Statecraft initiative at the Atlantic Council. His team works on a range of cybersecurity issues, including cloud computing, the security of the internet, supply chain policy, and growing a more capable cybersecurity policy workforce. Previously, he was a senior security strategist at Microsoft working on cloud computing and supply chain security policy. Dr. Herr also served as a fellow at the Belfer Cybersecurity Project at Harvard's Kennedy School and a non-resident fellow with the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Our third witness is Ms. Katie Moussouris. Ms. Moussouris is founder and CEO of the cybersecurity company Luta Security. She led the launch of the first bug bounty programs at both Microsoft and the Department of Defense, and has also helped start Microsoft's supply chain vulnerability program. She is a co-author of documentation on vulnerability disclosure and vulnerability handling processes for the International Organization for Standardization. Ms. Moussouris is a visiting scholar with the MIT Sloan School, a Harvard Belfer affiliate, and advisor to the Center for Democracy and Technology. Our final witness is Mr. Vijay D'Souza. Mr. D'Souza is a director of the Information Technology and Cybersecurity at the GAO, where he leads a diverse set of evaluations on government cybersecurity and IT issues. His current work focuses on the SolarWinds breach, use of the NIST cybersecurity framework, and IT modernization efforts at USDA. Mr. D'Souza also leads GAO's Center for Enhanced Cybersecurity, which provides advanced technical support for GAO's cybersecurity audits. And as our witnesses should know, each of you have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. And when you've all completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. And I will also mention that at the end of our hearing here, after I gavel it closed, any of our witnesses and members who wish are welcome to sort of hang around and talk informally, which is often a very valuable part of hearings that we do informally at the end when we're meeting in the non-virtual world. And we will start now with Mr. Scholl. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairwoman Stevens, Ranking Member Waltz, Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, and members of the subcommittee. I am Matt Scholl, the Chief of the Computer Security Division at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on improving the cybersecurity of software supply chains. NIST has nearly a 50-year history working in cybersecurity. Most recently, threat activity has highlighted the IT supply chain as a major cybersecurity vulnerability. Cybersecurity risks associated with extended supply chains and supply ecosystems are significant, and the scope of these risks must be understood by companies and organizations as they continue to expand their use of digital technologies. To address the ever-challenging issues related to this cybersecurity risk, on May 12th, President Biden signed Executive Order 14028 to improve the nation's cybersecurity and to protect federal government networks. Recent cybersecurity incidents, such as the SolarWinds type of incident we are discussing here, are a sobering reminder that U.S. public and private sector entities face increasingly sophisticated malicious cyber activity from both nation-state actors as well as cyber criminals. NIST's role in this executive order will be to develop standards, tools, best practices, references, and other key guidance for use by any organization to enhance their software supply chain security. Specifically, NIST will address identifying and securing critical software. We will identify secure software development life cycles and practices for securing development environments. We will also identify security measures for the federal government in using critical software and requirements for testing software. In addition, NIST will initiate 2 pilot labeling programs to assist consumers in understanding the security properties in products that we all use. NIST will respond to these responsibilities in ways that are effective in reducing risks to our supply chain, while also continuing to facilitate the innovation and economic growth that a secure software ecosystem can provide. NIST's arsenal in the defense against cyber attacks is large and growing. NIST is responsible for developing reliable and practical standards, guidelines, tests, and metrics to help organizations with their cyber supply chain risk management. The public and private sector can use these NIST resources to create and conduct their cyber supply chain risk management programs. NIST also continues to work directly with federal agencies through practice guides, tools, models, best practices, fora, as well as membership on the Federal Acquisition Security Council. NIST provides a series of documentary guidance, data reference, tools, and testing as part of its program to specifically work on improving the efficiency, reliability, and security of software. Two specific examples of resources that NIST provides are the National Vulnerability Database and the National Software Reference Library. The National Vulnerability Database is a repository of all known and publicly reported IT vulnerabilities and is the authoritative source for standardized information on security vulnerabilities, which NIST updates daily. The National Software Reference Library creates unique digital signatures of software so that any organization can efficiently search for that software and determine if and where it might be deployed within its ecosystems. Another critical resource at NIST is the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. This collaborative hub is a place where industry organizations, government agencies, and academic institutions work together to address business' most pressing cybersecurity issues. We produce practical cybersecurity solutions that benefit large and small businesses and third-party service providers alike. In conclusion, NIST is proud of its role in establishing and improving cybersecurity solutions, as well as our longstanding and robust collaborations with our federal government partners, private sector collaborators, and international colleagues. NIST has continued to be committed to apply its expertise and help to solve the critical cybersecurity issues that face our nation now as well as in the future. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions that you might have.
Bill, you need to unmute.
Who did that to me? Okay. Next is Dr. Herr.
Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, Chairwoman Stevens, and Ranking Member Waltz, and the members and staff of the subcommittees, thank you for the invitation to speak today. My name is Trey Herr, and I run the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, a nonpartisan think tank based here in DC. For the past 2 years, my team and I have been looking at the security of software supply chains and cataloging a range of attacks against them. We're here in no small part because of the revelations about the Sunburst and SolarWinds campaign. The scale of this event and its impact on the cybersecurity policies of a new administration have received widespread appreciation, and this attention is duly warranted. But even in the crisis of the past few months, there were remarkable echoes of the past decade. Software supply chain attacks are not new, and they're becoming more visible and more consequential by the day. Over the past 10 years, there have been more than 140 attacks or disclosures of vulnerabilities fit to be used in such an attack against software supply chains. Of these, at least 30 have been positively attributed to governments around the world. Within just a few months of the public discovery of the Sunburst SolarWinds campaign, cybersecurity vendors reported 3 different state-backed software supply chain attacks targeting governments and high-profile companies in South Korea, Mongolia, and Vietnam. Where the most recent crisis impacted hundreds of organizations and perhaps tens of thousands of users, software supply chain attacks have been used to target millions of users at once. Software has spread to every corner of the human experience. Our watches have internet connections. Combat aircraft come with more code than many operating systems, and embedded software controls the operation of everything from medical hardware to our brake pedals. With this software comes security flaws and a long chain of updates from vendors and developers. This ongoing relationship between those that build code and those who use it creates a need for trust. Trust that the update you're about to apply is genuine and benign. Software supply chain attacks take advantage of and break this trust. The responsibility for the insecurity of these software supply chains lies at home more than with foreign adversaries. I'm encouraged by the proposals contained in the President's recent executive order. We can demand more of our vendors and of ourselves while learning from the lessons of Sunburst and a decade of software supply chain attacks. In the final analysis, it would be a mistake to equate software supply chain attacks to a new weapon system and an opponent's arsenal. These attacks are a manifestation of opportunity, pursuing targets, compromising weaknesses in the tools and code we depend on and which we even take for granted. Trust in software supply chain security is not built, nor is it broken in isolation. There are opportunities for meaningful progress, and NIST can play an important role to better protect the code we have embedded in our daily lives, with appropriate investment and greater focus on cloud security, automatable guidance, and secure software deployment, not just development. I commend the committee for the time and effort taken to prepare today's hearing. Recent events show us it is an unambiguously important topic. With that, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And next is Ms. Moussouris.
Thank you. Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, Chairwoman Stevens, Ranking Member Waltz, and distinguished members of the subcommittees, thank you for inviting me to testify today about how to improve software supply chain security. My name is Katie Moussouris. I'm the founder and CEO of Luta Security, a company that works with governments and complex organizations to create mature, robust, and sustainable vulnerability disclosure and bug bounty programs. We base these programs on the international standards, ISO 29147, vulnerability disclosure, ISO 30111, vulnerability handling processes, and our vulnerability coordination maturity model. I'm the co-author and co-editor of these international standards. With more than 20 years of professional technical and strategic experience in technology and information security as a penetration tester at Stake, followed by creating Microsoft Vulnerability Research, which handled supply chain vulnerability coordination, establishing Microsoft's first bug bounties and advising the US Department of Defense, resulting in the launch of Hack the Pentagon. Additionally, I served as co-chair of the NTIA Multi-Stakeholder Vulnerability Disclosure Working Group Subcommittee of Multi-Party Vulnerability Coordination. It is an honor to appear before these subcommittees to testify about the challenge that securing the software supply chain presents to our economy and to our national security. While supply chain attacks have become more prevalent in the headlines during the past few years, these types of attacks have been occurring regularly since the dawn of major operating systems, which are then used to compromise many downstream targets. This problem is not new, and believing that it is can impede meaningful conversations regarding potential solutions. One of the main reasons why these problems haven't yet been solved is that the cybersecurity industry itself is still in its infancy. While the United States and the world have grown exponentially faster in our dependence and complexity of increasingly interconnected technology. Even large organizations with many highly skilled technical workers struggle with getting the right resources in place to simultaneously respond to incidents and investigate and fix single vendor vulnerabilities, let alone supply chain vulnerabilities in both open and closed source software. In the global cybersecurity workforce shortage, estimated at over 3.1 million unfilled positions worldwide, over 500,000 of those unfilled cyber roles are in the United States. The United States participates in the software supply chain in many complex roles, as do our international partners and our adversaries. There are multiple ways that supply chain attacks can occur, and not all efforts to combat these various attacks result in the same return on investment. In our ongoing national effort to build up our cyber resilience, we must evaluate the efforts put forth with desired outcomes in mind to yield measurable increased security of the supply chain now. To address the complexity in software supply chain security, my testimony today outlines the problem space and offers proposed solutions and actions to measurably increase the cyber resilience of the United States and our international partners. I believe that following the recommendations, building upon some of the most important work and best practices in the public and private sector will increase our national security. Number one, providing CISA with the authorities and resources to oversee cyber readiness for the civilian federal government and as a resource to support privately owned critical infrastructure. Number two, amending FISMA to require an annual comprehensive federal maturity assessment and gap analysis that will identify critical gaps in people, process, and technology. Number three, conducting a CISA-led system dynamics assessment of ROI for each proposed new requirement in the Cybersecurity Executive Order to determine the priority of each based on the investments required to make a dent in the problem. And four, raising federal pay scales, especially in cybersecurity, to better compete with the private sector and investing in cybersecurity recruitment and training for existing and aspiring workers. In the early stages of building our cyber resilience, organizations focus first on incident response, which has been echoed in the Cybersecurity Executive Order's breach notification requirements, as well as CISA's request for more endpoint detection budget. Investing in better breach response is important, but the ROI for investment in breach prevention is higher, yet lacks the urgency to drive near-term action. While new requirements like SBOMs may make supply chain vulnerabilities faster to respond to in theory, producing or consuming an SBOM would have had no effect in stopping or detecting either the SolarWinds nor the CodeCov supply chain attacks. There are no tools that can produce this enriched vulnerability data that includes vetting actual exploitability at scale, forcing continued reliance on skilled cybersecurity workers to make that final determination of imminent risk and act upon it. In conclusion, I appreciate this committee's and CISA's leadership on cybersecurity and supply chain issues. The federal government must direct what resources we have while also growing our capacity at scale. As part of expanding CISA's role and resources, CISA should apply a system dynamics approach that models the effects of changing variables in a complex system, focused on a targeted approach to enhance security outcomes. Thank you for this opportunity to testify before the committee today on this critical issue. I look forward to answering any questions you may have for me.
Thank you. And next is Mr. D'Souza.
Hello, Chairs Foster and Stevens, ranking members Nolte and Walton, members of the subcommittees. Thank you for inviting me to testify today's hearing on SolarWinds and IT supply chain issues. My testimony is based on GEO's ongoing look at the SolarWinds cybersecurity incident and GEO's December 2020 report on IT supply chain risk management at federal agencies. The SolarWinds cybersecurity incident was arguably one of the most severe and sophisticated cyber attacks on the federal government, but much remains unknown publicly about the full impact. The attackers, now known to be affiliated with the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, were able to take advantage of weaknesses in the SolarWinds company's security practices to insert malicious content and updates that SolarWinds supplied to its customers, including federal agencies. Thus, the attackers were able to take advantage of what we generally consider good cybersecurity practice, patching and updating your software regularly. The government has taken a number of steps in response to SolarWinds. Beginning in December 2020, DHS's CISA issued an emergency directive and later several additional tools and pieces of guidance on how federal agencies and other organizations should respond to the attack. The most recent guidance was actually just issued a few days ago, and more remains to be done. A unified coordination group, including CISA, the FBI, NSA, and ODNI, was also created to coordinate the government's intelligence gathering and response activities. This group was recently disbanded and has shifted its focus to identifying lessons learned from the incident. GEO currently has work underway compiling what is known about the impact of SolarWinds on the federal government and what lessons have been learned. We recently issued a blog post on this issue and plan to issue a public report later this year. Although SolarWinds was both an unpleasant and unprecedented discovery, unfortunately, we can't be surprised that something like this occurred. In December 2020, just as the attack was announced by CISA, GEO released a public version of our report looking at how well federal agencies were keeping an eye on their IT supply chains. The bottom line, most agencies were not following even foundational practices in this area. We identified 7 practices that should be followed agency-wide. These include establishing executive oversight, developing a strategy, and developing a way to document and identify risks. For the 23 agencies we examined, none had implemented all the practices and 14 hadn't implemented any of the practices. Given what we now know about the threats we face, this is concerning. Agencies told us they hadn't implemented many of these practices because they were awaiting additional guidance, most specifically from the Federal Acquisition Security Council, or FASC. And it's true to date, the FASC hasn't issued detailed guidance that agencies may need to fully implement a supply chain risk management program. But it's important to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good in this case. NIST has had guidance in this area since 2015, and OMB has directed agencies to begin thinking about this issue since at least 2016. The foundational practices we focused on include basic issues such as identifying who is in charge and establishing an overall strategy and process. Well, as with all issues technology related, how you do this will change over time. SolarWinds demonstrates that it's important to get started on supply chain security right away. To be fair, it's important to note that there are a lot of federal activities underway looking at IT supply chain security. NIST is currently revising its existing guidance and hopes to reissue it in 2022 to incorporate best practices from federal and private organizations and to integrate with other NIST guidance. In addition, CISA has a task force underway that is trying to address some of the underlying issues in this area. For example, how do we encourage private companies to share information, and how do we certify and vet federal suppliers? We issued a more detailed sensitive report in October of last year that our December report was based on. In the October report, we made 145 recommendations to specific agencies to implement the foundational practices that I discussed. We have received updates from 6 agencies on their progress, but to date, none of the agencies have fully implemented our recommendations. It's not going to be easy to address IT supply chain issues, and what we do is going to change as we continue to learn more about the threats in this area. But if we want to be prepared for the next SolarWinds type incident, it's important for federal agencies to immediately begin addressing this issue and for Congress to continue its oversight through activities such as today's hearing. This concludes my statement. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. And at this point, we will now begin our first round of questions. The chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes. Mr. D'Souza, if we could step back for a moment and consider the federal response to SolarWinds. Could you please briefly go over the timeline of how the federal agencies responded? When was the federal government first made aware of the breach? How did the directions to address the breach roll out? And in general, did the system work as designed? And did all the federal agencies act quickly to remediate the breach?
Thank you. As I mentioned, the first public announcement from DHS was in December. Although it is our understanding they may have had some earlier information about the incident. The agencies were directed to respond to that, and certainly by April, our understanding is it had been largely addressed. However, the details are, we're still looking into the details. Part of what we're doing in our ongoing work is trying to look at the detailed information that was provided to Congress and to CISA and try to compile it to see kind of how it lines up.
Yeah, so what is the procedure when the first alert comes in through classified channels? And people realize this will have a big effect on the commercial world. Is there a well-defined protocol for deciding when the commercial world should be apprised of the threat?
So your question is when the government should let the private sector entities know about issues?
Correct. Yeah. Is there a well-defined procedure for that operates regularly?
I think there are procedures, but I think there's area for improvement. I think part of what this has established is the need for better information sharing. Part of what you touched on is, the executive order that the administration recently released directs DHS to do more to kind of specify the triggers in this area. There definitely are tools and processes in place. For example, there was some legislation passed a few years ago directly related to cyber information sharing. But our experience has been when we talk to the private sector, they definitely identify positive steps that the federal government has taken with regard to information sharing, but also a lot of room for improvement.
Mm-hmm. Would the rest of the panelists like to chime in on that issue? Any observations on, whether the system was badly designed or worked as it should, or what are we going to have to undergo a fundamental redesign to get a better result?
If I could add one point, is I think the processes are in place, but I think it's the trust building. I think there's a lot of there tends to be a lot of nervousness from the private sector about sharing information with the government. I'm not sure so much about the other way, although one of the issues the government has is sharing classified information, figuring out how to sort of declassify the information and share it publicly. So these issues have been identified, but we're definitely not where we need to be in this area.
Mm-hmm. And one of the decisions that the government and probably every player in industry has to do is the make versus buy decision. And, if we do a lot in Congress to encourage the government to contract with a large number of small businesses. All right, that is sort of the exact opposite of what you want to do for cybersecurity reasons. And how should we think about and handle that, that tension? Any observation, or some of you have experience with some of the large players in industry, where it's my understanding they just do a lot of stuff in-house, in part to avoid cybersecurity threats that they cannot control.
It's a good question asking about firm size and vendors, but I think it speaks to two issues. One is capability and maturity, but the other is innovation. And to some degree, the downside of a large vendor is the risk of a monoculture and the risk of some homogeneity in the way that that vendor approaches security and the way it manages the assumptions or the threat model that it has for its products. So I don't think it's necessarily a clean cut to say bigger is better. It can offer some efficiencies and some scale. And you will find in some cases at a number of these vendors, security teams that no other company could afford to maintain and talent that you're not going to find in very many places on the planet. But that said, a mix, a composition of small and large, I think is important.
I also think, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Matthew.
When you look at the build versus buy decision, it's not necessarily just the point issue of acquiring, especially in software, a piece of software, but it's a full range of life cycle costs that come with owning and maintaining a piece of software over time. And often in those cases, you will find industry has the persistence to some extent to be able to maintain and update, especially software now that is so dynamic in its nature in a way that sometimes the government is not able to.
And I'd like to add to that answer in terms of build versus buy. In some cases, we have to participate according to technical specifications. So even if we were to build technology ourselves, there still may be vulnerabilities inherent in the technical specification. That is one of the reasons why the United States, its partners, and also the adversaries that we have in cyberspace participate in international standard setting and specification setting. But there are going to be implementation issues if an underlying technical specification contains vulnerabilities. That is one of the common scenarios that requires multi-party vulnerability coordination across the supply chain.
Thank you. And I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Obernolte, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists. It's been a fascinating hearing. My first question is for Mr. Scholl at NIST. So one of the things that stood out to me from reading the GIO report was that when these organizations that had not implemented the best practices, when questioned about why they had not implemented them, the number one answer was a lack of federal guidance, which I think is probably got to be a source of frustration for you. Hopefully the executive order will help with that because it directs NIST to either identify existing standards and best practices or develop new standards and best practices to combat this problem. Do you have a preliminary feel for which of those two options NIST is going to take? Are there existing standards that you'll be able to identify, or are you going to have to write your own?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and it's an excellent question. We too are encouraged by the executive order and its ability to shine a focus on this issue, not just for the federal agencies, but for NIST and our work as well. Our preliminary look at fulfilling the requirements within the executive order will be to identify existing guidance or even specifics within existing guidance that we can call out and consolidate for use by the agencies. So first and foremost, we want to identify and cite work that exists rather than creates new work. After we have done that, we will work with both our industry and our agency partners to see if there are any critical gap areas in that existing work. And then that will form the nucleus for any new created items that we'll have to make. The timelines are short in getting out our initial deliverables. And so that is going to be our approach.
Well, thank you. That makes sense. And follow-on question, since you brought it up, obviously the timelines in the executive order are very ambitious. Do you think that they are realistic? And does NIST have the resources that you need to meet them?
NIST is certainly committed to meeting all of the objectives that NIST is assigned within the executive order, and we are on track and working toward achieving all of those objectives. So currently, NIST believes wholeheartedly that we will accomplish the objectives assigned to us. And even though the timelines for initial deliverables may be short, NIST is also committed to applying a sense of persistence to this activity over a much longer term. So the initial deliverable may be short, but we also plan on staying persistent on these issues over a much longer period of time as well.
Wow, great. Thank you. Well, we're certainly looking forward to reviewing what you've come up with. Then a question for Dr. Herr. So we've been talking about guidance here, but obviously guidance is meaningless without implementation. So what can be done to make the guidance that's being developed more implementable by federal agencies?
It's a great question, sir. I think part of the challenge that we've seen is that much of the standards process for software development, for security, for deployment is still rooted in PDFs and spreadsheets, I think, as you mentioned in your opening statement. And it presents an implementation challenge for any developer to then take that, interpret it, and try to write it into their own tools and build their own organic processes and policies. So I think the biggest thing, and we've seen calls for this from a number of folks in the community, is automation, right? Implementable guidance that can be pulled into common developer tools, into integrated development environments, and made an automated rule. And there's two sort of big drivers for this, or reasons for this. One is that ease of implementation, but the second is to keep pace with software development. So not just developers of varying levels of maturity and scale. Not everybody is a large software vendor. Many of these security concerns are coming from open source projects, small, not well-resourced academic outfits, places where we want to see good security practice, but we're not necessarily going to expect $1 million full-time security team. But the second is to keep pace with software development, where we may see 5, 10, 15 versions of a single product in one day. And so there is no process, no PDF-based audit framework that is going to allow someone to come along behind and check every box for every one of those versions. So I think automation really has to be the watchword, and to the extent possible where NIST is appropriately resourced to provide guidance to developers and to those that own these development tools on exactly how to implement that in those programs.
I completely agree with you. And then lastly here, not as a question as much as a comment on Dr. Herr, your response to Chairman Foster's previous question. You said that you thought that a mix of large and small companies is vital to the supply chain, and I completely agree. But I mean, I'd also like to highlight some other advantages of having more companies in the supply chain. Is maintaining diversity.
It is my understanding that specific guidance on definitions of major incident come through policy from the Office of Management and Budget to the agencies. This is further clarified and specified by CISA, whereupon an agency then identifies an issue, first then categorize it as reportable or not reportable under that OMB policy guidance, and then initially conducts the first reports back to CISA and OMB. This is my understanding. Often, first analysis and initial forensics of an issue may be incomplete or inaccurate. So I believe agencies are encouraged to err to the side of reporting, just to be safe. But that lack of sometimes initial information does make the clarity of reportable versus non-reportable incident difficult, at least upon initial report.
You see why that causes us great concern. Would anybody else on the panel like to touch on this subject with recommendations about how to improve reporting and transparency under FISMA?
Sure, if I could. A major incident is basically an incident that's likely to result in demonstrable harm to the U.S. interests. So, I mean, I think just from instinct, SolarWinds would meet that criteria, but we do know that several agencies looking at the same criteria came up with different determinations. So I think part of what we're doing in our work, for example, is to compare the decision making by the different agencies. I do think a more consistent interpretation of the guidance is probably something that's going to be important.
I would also like to add that some of the resources internally to investigate some of these issues are the same resources that have to, implement security best practices, as well as performing these investigations, as well as investigating potential vulnerability reports that ideally have not been exploited yet. We have an overstretch of internal cybersecurity resources across the private sector as well with those unfilled job roles. The problem is exacerbated across the federal government.
Anyone else? Mr. D'Souza, is there presently an oversight mechanism by which federal agencies that fail to implement requisite standards and best practices under ICT SCRAM can be held accountable? And if so, can you briefly describe that process?
We think that there's a weakness in this area. There are a number of processes that federal agencies have to follow for oversight generally in IT security. There's the annual FISMA reporting. DHS has authority in this area as well through its binding operational directives. However, the specific issue of supply chain risk management, it's really the FASC, the federal, the organization I mentioned earlier, that is going to have sort of the enforcement ability here. And they have not done a lot in this area. They issued a strategic plan and they issued an interim rule, but more needs to be done there. The agency inspector generals, which do the annual FISMA evaluations, they did add one metric related to supply chain security to their latest evaluation guidance. But that was just added after SolarWinds. So, clearly we need to probably add more to that area going forward. And then both the IGs and OMB are going to need to incorporate that into their annual reporting. This is going to take, several years to really change the culture and really make sure agencies are dedicating the resources they need to do, but they couldn't do it through the existing oversight mechanisms.
Clearly, Mr. Chairman, this is an area we need to keep track of. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 5 minutes. Mr. Perlmutter, you're being recognized for 5 minutes of questions. And you must unmute.
Sorry,
Yes.
I'm multitasking here. I've
And there was a
couple
last
things
minute
going.
change in order. Right.
Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
All right, good. Sorry. So I just have a few questions. And first, Dr. Scholl, where is your office?
I am located in Gaithersburg, Maryland.
Okay. And is that where most of your staff is?
Correct.
Okay. We've been working with NIST for several years, and I've got several of my financial services committee colleagues on here, a bill called the Data Breach Insurance, where we've tried to use the NIST protocols for, to get small businesses, not so much because of federal hacking, but because of hacking that a small business might have that then affects their lender or their bank, which then spreads every place. And we've been trying to use both insurance and tax incentives to couple those with the NIST protocols. How do you find your protocols that you guys established back in 2014, 2015 being accepted by small business generally? Is it, you see it happening or not?
We see it happening across a wide range of both small businesses as well as levels of use and adoption. We have a couple of different mechanisms to do that. We have a dedicated small business corner where we look to tailoring and adapting our work to small businesses. Chairwoman Stevens had mentioned the MEP centers as well, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Centers that NIST has around the country, which we also use to tailor and amplify NIST cybersecurity products out to small businesses through the MEP centers as well. So we have a couple of different mechanisms that we use to try to both tailor our guidance so it's appropriate for a small business as well as reach them.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I guess from the financial services standpoint, we're just trying to, the banks say, well, the vendor caused this hack and vice versa, and who's going to pay for it? So we're going to continue to press forward in providing incentives and promoting that protocol. But my next question is for Ms. Moussouris and Dr. Herr, because you both said something that was a little bit troubling to me, and they involve sort of, I guess I'll start with you, Dr. Herr. There was an effort a number of years ago at the federal level to have a single portal for all the departments, all the agencies, everything goes through there, and they use some kind of, and Mr. D'Souza, you may recall this too, something called Einstein, or I can't remember what the heck it was, to try to, be a first guard against hacking. But there has always been a desire to try to have sort of separate silos so that everything didn't get hacked at once. I mean, what's your opinion on something like that? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes, sir. And I think the question you're asking is one that's been discussed at length over the last 5 to 10 years in cybersecurity. It's the debate between a walled, garden, effectively, right? A single perimeter that you defend with your life, and then acknowledging that that perimeter is not going to save you from the enemy and figuring out how to adapt to that. So Einstein, as I understand it, is a multi-generational set of systems intending to detect and mitigate attacks on federal networks as rapidly as possible in time, potentially to also eject them automatically. The challenge is, I think, to the question that you're asking, is that trying to take a network and isolate it from the outside world to keep it pristine is what we've seen in many cases fail against both rudimentary and sophisticated attacks. And that in SolarWinds and Sunburst, I think what we're seeing really good evidence of is the need to embrace the concept that's known as assume breach, to look at your network, to assume that it's been compromised, and to try to minimize the harm that any one device or any one user can do to you as they're moving through those networks. So I think Einstein, is a pathway towards that. Hopefully, there's been some discussion about the notion of zero trust, which you saw in the executive order to a great extent. Zero trust is a useful concept. It's a design philosophy. There's a lot of maturation still required there to take that and actually implement it into policy. But I think that gets to the question you're asking.
Thank you. And Ms. Moussouris, do you have a thought about that?
Yes, Einstein, has limitations, much like many other, cybersecurity tools, in that it is limited to look for what is already known and identified. In the SolarWinds instance, for example, that wouldn't have been detectable using Einstein or truly any other off-the-shelf tools. And that's evidenced in the fact that one of the top companies for investigating internal compromises, FireEye, even itself failed to detect that compromise for a few months while the attackers were working using the SolarWinds software that they had compromised. To your point about network segmentation internally, we do want organizations to move away from the model of hard, crunchy outside, soft, chewy center. So that is an apt observation of what needs to go into place. I think the executive order further stipulates that multi-factor authentication needs to be applied and rolled out across federal government systems, especially at access points to critical assets. That endeavor in the executive order, while bold and necessary, is going to be a huge, heavy lift. So that is something to be aware of, that parts of the solution, including that example of rolling out multi-factor authentication to tightly access control or monitor the access control of various assets in the federal government, that is going to require a very, very heavy lift.
Thank you. My time is way over, and I thank the chair and the ranking members for allowing me, and I yield back.
Thank you. And we'll now recognize Mr. Gonzalez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses and panel for their testimony today to discuss the importance of our cybersecurity infrastructure. SolarWinds exposed multiple government and private sector vulnerabilities. The witness testimonies today have illuminated some improvements that I think we can make. I want to talk briefly about public-private partnerships and data and information sharing with respect to how we solve this going forward. I was speaking with one of my friends yesterday who works in the industry, the cybersecurity industry, and his comment to me was, we share information across portfolio companies. This gentleman happens to work in private equity with respect to cybersecurity and cyber threats, but there's not a great coordinating mechanism either at the federal level or in private industry. And we can do it with our companies, but broadly there's less information sharing. So I guess Ms. Moussouris, from the industry perspective, I want to get your insight on this notion of cyber threat sharing across agencies and industry. Do you think there needs to be further collaboration, and do you think one of the existing public-private partnerships on cybersecurity is the best way to foster this collaboration? Just help me understand from your perspective what we might gain from this sort of thing.
Well, I think information sharing with the private industry is very much gated upon perceived or actual liability for those private organizations. So that is something that's been brought up numerous times, not just in this hearing, as something that would need to be addressed to provide sufficient legal cover for organizations that are seeking to share, private organizations. I do think that, you know, some of our issues here are information sharing when there has been a breach versus before the breach, which is the vulnerability coordination type of information sharing. So when you are coordinating a vulnerability that affects a supply chain, ideally you're doing so ahead of a breach. So that is a different kind of information sharing that poses its own risks in terms of, you know, investigations in progress up and down the supply chain, remediation plans in progress and being coordinated up and down the supply chain. The risks to that information sharing being accessed by an attacker is something that is of concern, especially with some of the executive order breach notification requirements that are in place, because some of the deadlines would be occurring sort of mid-investigation of a potential vulnerability that could lead to a supply chain attack or a breach. Does that sort of answer your questions?
Yeah, it does. How would you recommend we mitigate that risk? If at all? I mean, what ideas do you have on that?
Well, you know, some of this has to be built out in terms of capability. It is why I'm recommending maturity assessments for capabilities, not just in regular cybersecurity practices, but also in the specialized internal practices that are required for multi-party vulnerability coordination. Microsoft itself, with its significant investment in cybersecurity, has only been tackling this problem head on of supply chain vulnerability coordination with other entities since about 2008, when I created Microsoft Vulnerability Research to help coordinate Dan Kaminsky's DNS vulnerability. Was one of the first issues that we coordinated industry-wide and including our government partners.
Thank you. And then in your testimony, you mentioned some improvements that can be made to the software bill of materials. Can you elaborate on some of the concerns with creating machine-readable inventory that is uniform?
I have no issues with creating machine readable inventory that is uniform. The concerns that I have around implementing SBOM is that, one, you know, it may yield dividends to us in terms of speeding up vulnerability coordination across the supply chain in time. However, that working group has been at it for about 3 years, has not come up with a standard definition of what a minimum SBOM would entail, and that is part of NIST's big heavy lift to do as part of this executive order, is defining what a minimum SBOM would be. An ingredient list alone does not give you actionable information, nor does a mapping to which CVEs, which vulnerabilities apply to those ingredients. You actually need additional technical information, including the exploitability of a particular sub-vulnerability that may be included in a product package. So those are a summary of my concerns in that area.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. And we'll now recognize Mr. Byer for 5 minutes.
Dr. Foster, thank you very, very much. This is really fascinating. I'm very grateful. Mr. D'Souza, how do you live with the frustration? Let me just point out that 5 months ago, GAO recommended 23 agencies adopt these 7 procedures. That's 7 times 23, that's 161 opportunities to succeed. 16 of them did it. So you get a 10% completion ratio. As I read it, 14 did nothing. They complained about lack of guidance, and yet there was SCRM guidance from NIST in 2015, from OMB in 2016. You put out 145 recommendations in October 2020. As somebody who was never late with a paper or unprepared for a test, even if I didn't do well in the test, how do you, is there any consequence for our public leaders who just don't do their job?
I think as I was commenting earlier, I think enhanced reporting and oversight here is really going to be key to making changes. Agencies always face, more things to do than they have time for. So they have to make a decision about what are they going to devote the most time to. If the status of their supply chain security programs is routinely reported on and measured by Congress and measured by OMB, and there's more transparency around these issues, I think that they will make progress in these areas. I think that's basically the thing that has to happen.
This slides right into a question from Ms. Moussouris. Luta Security, you had 4 very good suggestions, but the last was that federal pay scales across the board, especially in cybersecurity, have to be able to compete with the private sector. I represent Northern Virginia, where every contractor I talk to, every business I talk to says they can't find the sophisticated people that they need. How are we, do you see any plausible political way of paying federal employees enough money to compete with the private sector? Like even a third of what they can make in the private sector?
Well, I think that especially those of us with offensive security skills that can hack into everything, money is not our deciding driver of what we choose to do with our talents. Mission is also very important. But even with such an important mission and an honor to contribute to national security, I think there does need to be, an effort to uplift the cybersecurity salaries in the federal government. But another part of that suggestion number 4 in my testimony was actually hiring and training either existing employees in the federal government who desire to move into cybersecurity, but also providing a better national pipeline for hiring talent. Most of the cybersecurity job openings that you see are for senior and very experienced people. We do not have a great pipeline for entry-level cybersecurity positions, which may help with some of the talent shortage and some of the budgetary concerns.
And it sounds like the talent shortage and the budgetary concerns feedback into what Mr. D'Souza has to work with. When if you have people that don't have enough time, they're overwhelmed by the challenges that they have and may not have the training either. As long as we're talking consequence, maybe Ms. Moussouris, one more thought. When any of these supply chains things happen, or when they shut down Colonial Pipeline and we see the consequence ripple through the economy and, with not much imagination, ripple through the fatality rates. It hits hospitals, it hits pharmacies. What should the consequences be? And I'm reminded of in the Old West, when you stole a horse, you got hung because it was life or death in that situation. It's life or death for so many people right now. And yet you never hear about anybody going to jail for violating cybersecurity. What you typically hear is they get hired.
Was there a question in there for me?
I guess I'm asking you to lay out the criminal penalties for hacking. So,
the Colonial Pipeline issue, as you are aware, sir, was orchestrated by non-Americans. They were a Russian cybercrime group. So I do think that, some additional pressure from this administration on not harboring cybercrime groups or turning a blind eye towards their activities internationally will go a long way. But in terms of domestic cybercrime, or domestic origin cybercrime, I do think that there's a lot of opportunity for reform in existing cybersecurity anti-hacking laws. There's been a lot of ambiguity and a chilling effect on good cybersecurity researchers who happen to be able to perform very bad activities against critical infrastructure. And only recently have vulnerability disclosure programs been in place in the federal government level, but certainly hasn't trickled down to all of critical infrastructure in terms of allowing the public to notify if they see something, say something in cybersecurity. So I do think that we need to take a look at ways to redirect young talent in cybersecurity domestically, especially if they got into a little bit of trouble when they were young. I do think that that is a potential huge source of cybersecurity talent eventually.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will now recognize Mr. Caston for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists. I want to start with my own experience that I'm hoping is not too stale. Before I came to Congress, I ran a company that we built and operated utility operations inside industrials, which is to say that we managed huge campuses that had a ton of dome equipment, valves, traps, meters, lots of PLC-based systems. And we were sort of keenly aware that they didn't dispatch in the most efficient possible way. But when we tried to bring in an overarching system control to manage it, we never got comfortable that we could maintain, I think, as you described, Ms. Moussouris, that hard, crunchy exterior. But we knew we had the creamy interior if we let them in. And to take it maybe in less metaphorical language, we couldn't find the software to solve the problem. And so we're then backing up to saying, well, can we implement the processes that would allow this? And as a mid-sized company, we just couldn't get comfortable that we could have the human resources, the process around to manage it. And so my first question for you, Ms. Moussouris, is there's a whole set of these solutions that are technical in nature, software patches, standards, what have you. There's a whole other set of solutions that are process in nature. When you are advising companies in the private sector, is there a single answer to that, or for a given problem, or does it depend on the size of the organization?
It depends on a number of factors. That's why we conduct maturity assessments, because an organization can be at a different maturity level for different areas of cybersecurity at a given time. Usually cybersecurity efforts are somewhere between the basement of compliance and the ceiling of whatever, best practice trends were successfully marketed to the CISO of that organization. Whether or not those practices in between are effective at securing an organization, it depends. And I've seen very large organizations struggle with maturity in vulnerability disclosure and coordination, for example, even when they are doing well in other areas of cybersecurity. So there are specializations and maturity changes over time. A recent study said that there were no magic bullets, no definitive correlations between certain best practices in cybersecurity and security outcomes.
Okay, so my district is a lot of small suburban towns. And I've recently been getting the question from a lot of the, small municipal water utilities who are saying that they're grappling with this issue. They've got, diverse assets and are starting to get concerned that they're not going to be able to get the cyber insurance they need to protect their assets because there's no credible way that they can provide that scope of maturity that you described. Are there good models out there for organizations banding together to provide some kind of an umbrella security, right? Or does that create a security vulnerability of its own? So, should I be recommending to all these municipals to say, everybody pitch in your 20% to hire a cybersecurity unit, or does that create more problems that we'd have to be mitigating in some other fashion?
Well, there may be some problems with, having enough resources if you are relying on a single or very few shared resources in terms of a shared cybersecurity team across some different organizations. But you also run into a sort of a single point of failure if that centralized security team is compromised in and of itself. And certainly all major organizations have been compromised at one point or another. And the adversaries do tend to go for, highly valuable information systems, accounts, and leverage additional attacks from there. So aggregation may have some efficiencies gained, but it also may present an attack surface and a further overtasking of those resources.
Well, you've maybe perfectly teed up my final question for Dr. Herr, which is I'm going to confess wildly outside of the jurisdiction of this committee. My roommate in college senior year, his dad was a New York City beat cop for a long time. And he joked with me at one point that he had no idea why criminals ever committed anything but white collar crime, because the risk reward for white collar crime was so much better than everything else. And and I share that story because if our enemies wanted to attack and take Rhode Island from us, there are a whole lot of rules around kinetic warfare. But if they wanted to steal all the data from JP Morgan, it's probably a lot more valuable and there's a lot fewer rules. So, you know, we can put all these standards in place, but I'm curious, Dr. Herr, do we need something like a Geneva Convention for cyber warfare that we have for kinetic warfare?
No, I appreciate the question, sir. And as a native of Massachusetts, I suspect Rhode Island would be a tough fight. You know, I think the question that you ask about a broader geopolitical response is a good one. I think the Geneva Convention is a very bad model for what we talk about here for two reasons. One, the consequence scale of the events that we're talking about on a daily basis do not come anywhere near to match the horrors of chemical warfare or nuclear conflict. The second, though, is that sort of broad, as much of the globe as possible kind of multi-stakeholder collaboration gets us to a point of very low accomplishment, right? We have as many people bought into a very small standard, a very little bit of progress as possible. And I think, unfortunately, the cyber norms process has demonstrated that over the last decade. Instead, I would suggest that our thought process for this is, rather than a negotiated settlement or a set of rules, how do we get more competitive? How do we, as we think about this, not as trying to prevent a catastrophe, but more like improving our batting average? How do we get up to the plate and start taking more walks? How do we start hitting just a few more singles each time? And if that's about protecting some of these lower hanging fruit, some of these targets, or if that's just competing against many of these adversaries more effectively, I think that gets us to a place where we're able to keep JP Morgan and Rhode Island safely at home at night where they need to be and avoid any sort of catastrophe down the line.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. And we will now recognize Representative Ross for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also to Chairwoman Stevens for holding this very crucial and timely meeting. I'm from North Carolina, so I want to let you know I represent the Research Triangle area of North Carolina, and we have a lot of tech companies there, including SAS, Red Hat, Pendo, and the companies have a talent pipeline that comes through our colleges and universities. And to Ms. Moussouris's issue of building this pipeline, we have a secure computing institute at NC State University that has become a focal point for cybersecurity research. And at our community college, at Wake Tech Community College, we have it's been designated a National Center of Academic Excellence in Cyber Defense Education. So I think we need a field trip to my district. I'm pitching that to the whole committee. And while I recognize that ransomware isn't the topic of this hearing, the Colonial Pipeline has come up several times, and because it affected my district so acutely, I just wanted to ask, in particular, Dr. Herr and Ms. Moussouris, had the requirements articulated in the May 12th executive order been adopted by private industry, do you think the cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline would have unfolded the way that it did?
I think there's no way to give a definitive answer, unfortunately, because much of the order, which is, I think, aspirational and positive in the direction that it's heading, is still to be decided, and it sets up processes and policies to be defined. But to your question, the focus on IT security and on the security of software certainly couldn't have hurt in the context of what Colonial faced.
I would say that the Colonial Pipeline attack allegedly occurred because of a successful phishing attempt that was an administrator clicking on a link that they shouldn't have. Internal network segmentation, asset management requiring robust multi-factor authentication may indeed have helped slow down the ransomware attack. However, ransomware is opportunistic. It is just, it's an opportunistic monetization of vulnerabilities that exist. So whether they are partly due to human error is one thing, but certainly network segmentation and multi-factor authentication tagged to specific assets may have helped mitigate it. It might not have completely eliminated the possibility of that attack taking place.
Okay, thank you both. And Mr. Scholl, your testimony talks about the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which is a public-private partnership that works to address business cybersecurity challenges. And I wanted to know, has the private sector shown any interest in the NIST standards and best practices? And what can we do to get them more on board? Because they just can't, wait for something bad to happen or say it costs too much. What can we do to make them more robust participants?
So yeah, thank you for the question.
I'm moving, so I have turned my video off.
The private sector has shown great interest in NIST's work, in the guidance that we've developed. This initially was seen in 2015 when we created the cybersecurity framework under a previous executive order, which had outstanding participation from the private sector in its development. The cybersecurity framework and all of NIST's work is voluntary for use outside of the US government. So NIST is not a regulatory agency, nor do we wish to be one. But we find, because of that, participation and use of our work on a voluntary basis does seem to be rather robust. As far as furthering that participation through other mechanisms, I'm actually not sure what would be good levers in order to have that from the private sector.
Okay, well, maybe we should explore that. If anybody has any ideas for good levers, yes, Ms. Moussouris.
I think that, adding federal procurement guidelines and leveraging the NIST framework and requiring that companies that want to do business with the federal government comply with some of these NIST guidelines and standards is a good step in that direction.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And now, without objection, we will attempt to recognize Representative Baird despite his having video problems right now. If the audio is working, Jim, are you available here?
I'm here. Thank you.
Okay, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. And good afternoon. And I really appreciate Chairwoman Stevens and Ranking Member Waltz of the Research and Technology Subcommittee. And Chairman Foster, I appreciate your efforts, and Ranking Member Obernolte of the Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee for holding this important hearing over the SolarWinds incident. So I guess my first question goes to Dr. Herr. In your testimony, you point out that since 2010, there have been at least 30 different state-backed software supply chain attacks on the United States from states including Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, as well as others. So the United States is increasingly being targeted with cyber attacks as the nation states are focusing on using cyber capabilities for malicious intent. As the scale of our cybersecurity posture is growing at a slower pace than emerging threats, how can the United States shore up our cybersecurity in order to protect our networks from our foreign adversaries?
Yes, sir. And I would point out only that those 30 attacks impacted a variety of countries, although the U.S. was certainly a leading part of that whole. I think there's a whole host of answers, and we could hold a number of hearings on the topic, but I'll give you two. The first is better combining the activities of our offensively focused organizations with those focused on defense. That part of the challenge that we face is where defense is rooted entirely in audits and compliance, it lacks the focus on where adversaries are attempting to push their own tactics and their techniques and their technologies. And so one of the failings that we recognize in our reporting on Sunburst is an inability for defenders to recognize software systems which were relatively small and innocuous, but incredibly valuable to attackers based on where they were placed on a network or the permissions that they were granted. And so I think informing defenders with what offensive agencies see on a more regular basis and trying to push that offensive mindset as defenders are choosing where to invest and prioritize, I think is important. But the second, and it's been mentioned a number of times today, is that as we seek to improve our defensive posture, we have to push to automate as many of these activities as possible. There's a really good piece of work that's been done. I think the term was coined by Winnie Nather of Cisco in 2011, the notion of the cyber poverty line. The majority of the organizations operating the technology that we care about, the potential targets of the next decade, don't have the resources or the internal maturity to operate at a high level of sophistication, to make many of their own choices and judgments. They have the ability to plug things in and hope for the best. And so what they plug in and how they monitor it has to be as capable as possible out of the box and supported from as many directions as possible. So I would come back and suggest to you that while we do have reasonable threats in these high consequence attacks and have a lot of conversation to be had about what the US is doing with allies and outside of its borders, that at home, a key part of our focus should be trying to resource and support with technology that's as usable as possible those folks that are most likely to be the target of these events.
Thank you. Dr. Foster, do I have any time left? I've got one more question.
You have 1 minute and 45 seconds. And
there we go. 1 minute,
20
45 seconds
after that.
Okay. So I have a joint question for Dr. Herr and Ms. Moussouris. And that is, in the months since the SolarWinds incident, it's become clear just how sophisticated this hack was. And with some estimating, the operation involved over 1,000 engineers. And states like Russia and China have they can deploy the manpower to carry out an operation like this. So what actions need to be taken to ensure that the United States is capable of defending our networks at this scale? Dr. Herr, you want to start?
Sure, I'll say only that 1,000 engineers number has come under significant and I think fairly accurate criticism. While there were likely a large number of people, perhaps more than 1,000, involved in processing all of the intelligence gathered in this operation, the number involved in actually building and maintaining the tools that targeted these US government agencies and private sector organizations was likely substantially smaller. What that suggests, though, is that manpower is not a good measure of impact. And I think we've seen that repeatedly in cyber.
Okay. Ms. Moussouris?
Absolutely agree. The 1,000 engineers number, I believe, was produced by Microsoft and by their head lawyer. So I don't think that that number is realistic in terms of what we're up against in that particular attack. I do think that our numbers of people who can perform some of the most sophisticated attacks worldwide is actually a fairly small number. I can provide references after this hearing on the record for some of the labor market numbers that I and colleagues at MIT and Harvard had studied the vulnerability economy and exploit market and estimated some of those numbers worldwide. So we are, in the United States, obviously needing to create more of those elite cyber warriors who have the ability to create those types of attacks ourselves. But the number of them tends to be fairly small worldwide because the target gets harder and more sophisticated. The latest operating systems, latest phone operating systems get hardened further and further, and that enhances the technical need, the bar to meet to carry out attacks of that sophistication level.
Thank you very much for those responses. I wish I had time to question the other witnesses, but I'm sure I'm out of time. So thank you, Dr. Foster, and I yield back.
Thank you. And now, before bringing this hearing to a close, I want to thank our witnesses for testifying before the committee. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and any additional questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. And the hearing is now adjourned.